I want to first thank the conference organizers for including this paper in such an exciting program. This is a paper joint with Akash Chattopadhyay, who's now at Rotman, as well as Matt Schaefer, who's here today. Matt's one of our star doctoral students at HBS, and he'll be on the market this coming year. So we in corporate governance, and for policymakers in general, we're very deeply interested in this question of how do we go about changing persistent behavior. Now, standard economics would have us focus on the role of formal contracts and pecuniary incentives. Now, an alternative that's gaining some ground in this field is the idea of using strategies, non-pecuniary strategies, such as changing norms or focusing on the hierarchy, status hierarchy of behaviors. Strategies that might be particularly useful in contexts that might impose some constraints on formal contracts. And related to this question is a novel phenomenon recently, which is the rising interest in the idea of using stock indexes as an alternative mechanism to influence or shape the standards of corporate behavior. Over the last decade, we've seen a growing number of stock indexes focused around CSR or ESG themes. Most notably, last summer, the world's two largest index providers made the decision to exclude certain companies with multiple voting share classes from their main indexes. Okay. Now, perhaps broadly, we could view this phenomenon as arising as a result of at least a perception that the standard process of bargaining or contracting isn't sufficiently effective in transforming or shifting corporate norms in the desired direction, and so some alternative mechanisms are being sought out. Now, despite these very significant decisions and the subsequent debate that continues to be ongoing today, we as researchers really don't know much about whether, how effectively, or through what incentive channel stock indexes could influence corporate behavior. One theory might be that stock indexes serve to intensify the formal incentives that managers have by providing capital market benefits. An alternative might be that stock indexes could also provide non-pecuniary incentives by promoting certain behaviors as ideals or functioning as gauges for virtuous behavior. Okay. In this paper, we're going to try to tackle these questions motivated by kind of the broader question about how do we go about changing persistent behavior by leveraging the Japanese context and studying the index inclusion incentive effects arising from the so-called JPX Nikkei 400 index, which was created to try to boost the profitability among Japanese firms. And we think this is a very powerful setting for studying these kinds of questions, in large part because this is a very salient example in which a central policymaker deployed a stock index in order to address a long-standing and fundamental economic problem. Moreover, because this setting is one where that imposes certain significant constraints on formal contracting, it also provides an opportunity for us to learn a bit more about the potential motivating power of non-pecuniary incentives that indexes could provide. As it turns out, the issue of corporate profitability is one of central economic import in Japan. There's this famous Ito report that was produced for the Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry, which showed that if you look at the distribution of ROE in 2013 among the largest firms in Japan, what you'd find is a mean ROE that's just a little bit over 5%. And to put that into context, that's half of the European average and a quarter of the US average among the large firms that year. And that's not reflecting some idiosyncrasy, some transient phenomenon in Japan in 2013. In fact, when we went back and looked at the long-run distribution of ROE in the 10 years prior to the introduction of this index, what we found was something I thought quite astounding. We found that 77% of companies that existed in this entire decade produced a long-run ROE that was lower than 8%. This is the nominal cost of equity benchmark used in the Ito report. If that's the right benchmark, what this tells us is that more than 3/4 of companies in Japan destroy value for shareholders in the long run. It's not so surprising, therefore, that this became a central structural issue that was targeted by Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's administration. In fact, improving ROE was regarded as one of the central cogs for transforming the economy and boosting the capital markets. Now, to understand some of the policies that were being considered, it's useful to understand the context a little bit more. Probably most of you know quite well, this is a context characterized by very strong historical corporate norms of deprioritizing shareholder interests in lieu of those of customers, employees, and suppliers. This is also a context that is dominated by very strong norms against issuing high-powered incentives and large payouts to corporate managers. In other words, there were some strong constraints against the usual contracting solutions that we might think of for a problem like this. So an alternative that was introduced in 2013 is the stock index, which I'll call JPX 400 for short. This was designed to showcase among the large and liquid firms in Japan its best 400 in terms of profitability, capital efficiency, and by reflection, good corporate governance. It's usually considered part of Abe's third era of governance reforms. One of the unique features of this index resides in the fact that selection into the index depends on a very transparent, quantitative, and ROE-based algorithm, which is going to be central to our research design, and I'll talk to you more about this later. But ex ante, we think that standard economic theory wouldn't necessarily predict this kind of a mechanism to have a strong incentive effect for managers. Because for one, managers have little, if any, financial incentives to want to improve ROE to get into this index. Why? Well, getting in, the index isn't going to pay you anything for getting in. Secondly, there's also very, very low pay-to-performance sensitivities in Japan. By our estimates, which is, we think, fairly consistent with the prior work, it's about 1/5 of the pay-to-performance sensitivity in the US. There's also little, if any, relational incentives for managers to want to improve ROE to get into this index, because doing so presumably requires managers to have to trade off the relational capital that they have with customers, employees, or suppliers. After all, we're improving ROE. Something's going to have to give. An alternative might be that the index could have an incentive effect to the extent that managers, they're influencing managers through some non-pecuniary or implicit incentive channels. And consistent with this kind of idea, what we observe is that the JPX 400 quickly acquired a very prestigious status in the marketplace as a gauge of Japan's best-run firms. Now, the status this is partly intentional through the formal endorsement that was granted by the government pension investment fund. This is the world's largest asset manager. They have over $1 trillion worth of assets. And historically, they've been largely invested in fixed income assets. So when for the first time, the GPIF puts its name and weight behind a thematic stock index, if it will, it really got people's attention. It shook the corporate governance world. Okay? What also helped to solidify this status was the subsequent media coverage, which provided, perhaps accidental, but certainly, I think, quite effective marketing. This index became colloquially referred to as the shame index, a reference to the emotions managers ought to feel should they be excluded from the club of the best-run firms in Japan. I think this quote here from last summer by the Financial Times is a very useful summary of this idea. It says that this index is by far the shiniest toy in the Abenomics box. Its constituents would be heroes. Its rejects would cringe in shame. So we're going to try and understand how such an index could provide any incentives at all for managers to change or improve their persistently low ROE in Japan, Japanese corporations. And our empirical strategy will rely heavily on the JPX 400 selection algorithm. So this is how it goes. Every year, at the end of June, the Japan Exchange Group identifies 1,000 eligible firms that are then ranked on the basis of the following three dimensions: 3-year average ROE, 3-year total operating income, and market capitalization. And then the top 400 companies are selected on the basis of a weighted average of these three ranks. And that's it. Okay? The only caveat is that the JPX reserves the right to replace up to 10 companies for reasons that are unknown to us, that they call qualitative adjustments. But by and large, observe how transparent and easily replicable this algorithm is. And by the way, in our view, the most controllable parameter here for managers is ROE. Certainly, it's the parameter most relevant for policymakers. A second thing to note here is that while the JPX publishes actual membership each year, the underlying ranks are not made available. And both of these things are going to have some implications for us. Why does this all matter? Well, how are we going to try to understand the ex-ante index inclusion incentive effects afforded by this index? Our empirical strategy will try and exploit the variation in index inclusion incentives, that is to say the treatment intensity. And this variation is going to come from the idea that firms who are closer to the threshold of exclusion or inclusion should have the greatest incentives to exert effort and improve ROE over the following year in order to either make it into the index or avoid getting kicked out. Okay, that's because the guys who are close to the cutoff have the highest marginal benefit for exerting effort, all else equal. What that should mean is that competition around the threshold should be highest, driving up the average level of effort among firms who are right around the threshold. Okay? Now, because even though the ranks aren't disclosed, managers, as well as their shareholders, and certainly we, the researchers, can in fact identify what their marginal benefit of effort is precisely because of the transparent, quantitative, easily replicable nature of this algorithm. So, in execution, in order for us to construct our empirical design, our difference in difference design, what we need as an input is to identify this relative intensity by replicating these JPX 400 rankings, okay? So which we do, but because it's such an important component of our research design, we're going to validate it first. I won't show you the table, but I'll just summarize here. Our synthetic rankings do a very good job. They do a very good job in predicting realized inclusion. They do a good job explaining the variation and inclusion likelihood to a high degree of accuracy. And we're going to use these synthetic ranks to then construct a kind of difference in difference design. But it's going to look a little bit funky, so let me try and I'll go through it step by step. Our first diff is going to be comparing the financial performance in the 3 years after the introduction of this index between the treatment firms, who are the firms that in a given year happens to be close to the threshold of inclusion, that is ranked 301 to 500. The threshold of inclusion is at 400, and thus have the strongest incentives, versus the control firms, who are the guys who are farther away from this threshold, ranked 501 to 800, and thus have weaker incentives. We're going to benchmark these guys against the financial performance differences between the guys ranked 301 to 500 and 501 to 800 in the 3 years prior to the introduction of this index. So this second diff, of course, is accounting for the possibility that this largely deterministic treatment assignment algorithm could be associated with natural differences in future ROE. Okay? So we're going to basically estimate this diff and diff, D1 minus D2 in the standard OLS specification. So what's different here? What's different is that treatment status, which by the way is not fully controllable by managers, is in fact varying over time. It's varying over time because firms' rankings, they're getting re-ranked every single year. Okay? And managers don't have full control over that because A, they can't fully control their ROE. There's some stochastic nature to this. And they can't control other firms' ROE. So their rankings are varying over time, and thus their distance from this threshold is varying year by year. So one way to kind of casually think about what this research design is doing is that we're in effect combining multiple experiments, if you will, in the post-JPX 400 period with multiple placebo experiments in the pre-period in order to infer what the incentive effect ex ante of this index would be for managers. Okay? The usual parallel trends assumption would have to apply here. I'll just show you our main results for the paper. We're going to be interested in studying the treatment effect on ROE, future ROE. We'll start with the most basic version of a diff and diff, and then just progressively add controls, year fixed effects, industry fixed effects, firm level covariates, lagged ROE. And observe that as we're doing this, while the R squareds are going up by a factor of 10, our coefficient estimates are staying relatively stable. I think Bernie made references to Emily Oster's paper, but she shows this work that says this should provide us with some level of comfort about the possibility of omitted variables confounding our results. But I'll show you more on that as well. If we interpret this last coefficient here from our most robust specification, which we use throughout the paper, what it says is that the treatment firms experience a relative increase of 2.4 basis points in ROE. And that proportionally is quite significant. Okay? It's about a 41% proportional increase relative to the pre-treatment mean. Now, before people go nuts, they also started at a very low level, so there's a lot of slack. Now, what we like to be able to do is to establish that these results, in fact, are reflecting index inclusion incentives rather than some alternative like an omitted variable. And so table 4, which I'll just summarize here, shows you the following. First, we confront the most kind of salient alternative that one might be worried about, which is that, well, your treatment and control firms might just have differential trends. Okay? In other words, your identifying assumption doesn't hold. So we're going to try to address this in a few ways. We have a set of results rejecting that there are differential historical trends between treatment and control and ROE. But it's still, and we're going to do this through a series of placebo tests using pre-JPX 400 data. But it could still be possible that even though historical trends are very similar, that going forward, differential trends apply. Now, this might be somewhat abstract, but certainly statistically possible that, look, some omitted variable appeared post-2013 that happens to be simultaneously correlated with your JPX 400 rankings, so treatment assignment, and future ROE. So what we do here is a series of contemporaneous placebo tests because we've been holding out 2 samples of companies to help us deal with this. One sample of companies who are JPX 400 eligible firms, who are the highest ranked firms, for whom we also find no effect relative to our control firms, and a holdout sample of JPX 400 ineligible firms. We go outside of the first 1,000 firms, rerun the algorithm, rerun the specification, we find nothing. Another possibility could be that our findings reflect some ex post consequences of index inclusion. Once you're in the index, you could have certain benefits that then produce greater ROE. We show that this isn't the case here in a couple of ways. One is that our main effect is no different when we split it between the set of treatment firms that are in the index versus the ones who are not in the index. But we also do a fuzzy RD design in which we show that inclusion per se has no effect on ROE. And finally, just to kind of drive home this idea that our results are reflecting variation in index inclusion incentives, we show that this ROE improvement is increasing in a firm's closeness to this cutoff threshold. Now, having established that firms appear to want to get into the index, we're very interested to understand why. What's the incentive channel that drives this change in behavior? So here we first begin by kind of considering the consequences of index inclusion. our setting is very natural for a regression discontinuity design, which is the standard methodology for addressing consequences of index inclusion in this literature. So we run the standard two-stage least square specification here and examine what happens, what's the effect of inclusion per se on ROE, sales growth, executive compensation, liquidity, book to market. And the answer is no effect on any of the above. Now, what might be the most surprising is the fact that we don't find significant capital market benefits from inclusion. But upon kind of scrutinizing the institutional details in Japan, I think it can be rationalized. But although I'm quite curious to hear in particular from our Japanese colleagues here who might be able to provide additional insight. Our understanding is that despite its fame, this is still an index that's not very much tracked by a lot of institutional investors. The demand for tracking this index is quite small, in particular relative to a TOPIX or Nikkei 225. Moreover, when you examine what's happening in this period in Japan, there was a near tripling in demand for all Japanese equity, TOPIX and Nikkei stocks, from BOJ's quantitative easing program and GPIF's increase in equity allocation. But the primary beneficiaries are TOPIX, the whole market basically, and the Nikkei 225. And so the incremental demand from inclusion for being in the JPX 400 is just very small relative to the broad trend. It's also possible, at least in theory, and as suggested by some of the recent literature, that maybe we shouldn't even expect there to be a capital market benefit to begin with, to the extent that the increased ownership is a result of ETFs, which is primarily how the BOJ was buying up the equity market. So if they're not getting capital market benefits, why do they want to be in? Maybe they just expected there to have been benefits and didn't get it. Or maybe they were motivated by the status from being associated with the JPX 400, being in this group of what's considered the best run firms in Japan. So how can we distinguish between these two? We're going to try and exploit the variation between the non-Nikkei 225 firms and the Nikkei 225 firms. Okay? Nikkei 225 is the kind of traditional leading index in Japan, in fact, in Asia. Now, why do we exploit this difference? Our argument is that we think that the incremental capital market benefits that could arise from inclusion should be much more important for the non-Nikkei 225 firms because these tend to be smaller, less salient, less established. The Nikkei 225 firms are already enjoy the greatest visibility and liquidity in the marketplace. On the other hand, the Nikkei 225 firms are much more likely to be concerned about their status in the marketplace because not getting into the JPX 400 implies a loss of status for them as a leading firm in Japan. So what do we find? We run through a couple of specifications, one set of diff and diffs in which we split the treatment into the two groups, and also we looked at a more stringent triple diff specification. And in all cases, we find that the Nikkei 225 firms experience significantly higher improvement in ROE, which suggests to us, if our hypothesis is right, that this is consistent with status incentives playing quite an important role in driving these managerial behavior in this context. Okay? I'll skip the supplemental findings and the overall, well, I'll just say that we do some back of the envelope here just to show that this index inclusion incentive effect that's offered by the JPX 400, if our estimates are right, you take them at face value, explains about 20% of the change in average aggregate net income in the entire market and about 20% of the increase in total market capitalization. Okay? All we're doing here is creating a club and validating some status on top of it that everybody believes in. So just to conclude, I think what we have here is evidence that's consistent with the idea that in a setting where there are strong constraints to contracting, changing the status hierarchy of desired behaviors could be effective in motivating significant changes in persistent behavior. Here, the validation by the GPIF and the subsequent media coverage or reference to this index as the gauge for the best run firms in Japan, the JPX really disrupted the status hierarchy among the Japanese indexes. or the hierarchy of what's virtuous behavior, if you will, lots of people ask me about the external validity of this paper and its findings, and I think you can think about this in a few ways. One is, I think the idea of using a prestigious index as a mechanism for addressing this persistently low capital efficiency problem in Japan is very much applicable to other East Asian economies with similar ROE and ROA problems and with very similar cultural contexts, okay? Cultures that care a lot about losing face, such as the one I come from. The idea that managers could be concerned about things like status or prestige, I think is also an idea that could apply quite generally, not just to East Asian managers, but to managers worldwide. Finally, and this is a bit speculative, but there have been some theories by sociologists and more recently by economists about the idea that, hey, look, norms are very sticky and they're very powerful motivators of behavior, but how do we change norms? There's a theory that in order to do this, you really need to get a small group of well-respected elites who can lead by example to start to shift norms. And you could think, at least one way of thinking about our results is that this could be one such mechanism, or this is the functioning of the JPX 400. By incentivizing some of the most established and well-respected firms in the Japanese market, the JPX 400 index could promote a broader shift in corporate norms. I will end there. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to discuss this paper. I enjoyed a lot reading the paper, and I learned a lot both reading the paper and also thinking about it. I think it's actually a very rich paper. Let me summarize the results very quickly. I think Charles did a good job. So the idea is to measure the reaction of firms to a purely symbolic incentive, which is to belong to this JPX 400 index. The paper focuses on the incentives to improve performance in the margin, right? Whether you want to belong to the index or not to be dropped from the index, whether these firms react to this incentive. And the paper also checks the effect of belonging to the index itself, but more in terms of ruling out that it's driving the results. I don't think that's the focus of the paper. It's more like trying to rule out that it's not the index itself that's causing it, it's the incentive to belong to the index. And the results show, first of all, that firms close to the index inclusion or exclusion improve their ROE. Not a lot in terms of exposed effects, like these direct effects of the index, and also heterogeneous effects. Firms that have more slack and those that have most to lose, the ones in the Nikkei 225, are the ones who are reacting the most. Let me give you the main intuition. So firms are ranked according to a total score that weighs your ROE, your operating profit or income. It wasn't clear, but it's not that important, and your market cap. And if you make it to the top 400 ranking on that number, you get into the index. So before the introduction of the JPX, you could calculate the average ROA of those firms at risk of belonging to this index that didn't exist. And you could, after the introduction of the index, you could check whether their ROE has gone up, right? Now you will worry, well, maybe it's the aggregate annual change in profitability that's driving this. So you need some kind of benchmark, some kind of control group. And these firms here, the firms below the 500 rank, they are too far to make it to the index, so they don't have incentives to distort their incentives. They're going to provide your control group. And you can do a standard diff in diff estimation in which you check that the incentive effect is going to be this distance net of that distance, right? It's a standard diff in diff setting in which these firms here serve as a control group. Now, let me show you some properties of this index rank. I think it's actually quite rich, and it took me a while to fully understand what's going on. The first thing I'm going to do is replace this operating income or operating profits by our operating ROE and market cap, right? So basically, this index has a component which is profitability, a component which is size, and a component which is size times profitability, right? And this helps actually understanding this score a little bit better. And here's the construct that we have. And the first thing we should know is that ROE is higher for lower ranks. One of the ranking criteria is ROE itself. So this thing has to go up towards the lower ranks, not monotonically because size is one of the other factors, but at least smoothing, you would get that effect. Second effect, within a rank, ROE and size are negatively correlated. Suppose you have two firms that are very close in the rank. One is big, the other one small. Well, the big firm is not profitable, the small firm is profitable. Right? This has to be because they tied, and it's only size and profitability that drive this index. Right? Third property, the relationship shapes slope with parallel or multiplicative shifts of ROE. What I mean here, suppose that you increase, for example, ROE by 50 basis points for every firm, a parallel shift in ROE. Well, this relationship shifts, actually. Why? Well, this doesn't change. This doesn't change because the ranking is preserved. But here, the big firms start overtaking the small firms. You have more attenuation bias. This relationship gets flatter. Suppose you multiply all the profits of firms by a factor of 1.1, this relationship gets steeper. Right? So there's lots of changes that seem parallel or very parsimonious on ROE that will not be parsimonious on this mapping. Third property, bigger firms improve their score more than small firms for a given change in ROE. Suppose two firms here that started here, one is small, one is big. Both of them improve their ROE by, say, 1%. Well, the small firm would climb a few ranks, but the big firm, because of this term here that has market cap, would climb many, many ranks. Right? The kick is much higher for big firms than for small firms. So several issues or things I would like to remark. First issue, I think aggregate time series variation in ROE can be a potential confounding factor, and Charles made a good effort trying to convince us otherwise. I'm going to try to show you the things that still worry me. So remember, anything you do to ROE, any affine transformation, virtually anything you do is going to change the slope of this function here. It's virtually impossible to even reverse engineer a parallel shift of that function. Now, the definitive setting is precisely specially designed to control for parallel shifts. Right? So the definitive setting would pick changes in the slope, and it's going to be difficult to distinguish whether this is an incentive effect or a change in the slope of this relationship. Now, fortunately, just to check one more thing, should we be worried where profitability in Japan was changing quite a lot during this period in general? So this is the pre and post periods. The paper does have, I don't know why this came this way, but the paper does have some placebo treatments that show that nothing happened in this period. The slope is not the same, but this is something that is useful to understand that there's nothing mechanical about it, but the slope is different, and the changes can be different. And I think this slide came wrong, but it doesn't matter. Now, fortunately, the environment is very rich, so you can do a lot of things to try to overcome this problem. So first possible solution, do a second diff in diff with the ranks below 300, right? So here's what the paper does. That's the diff in diff of these firms versus these firms here, right? But look at these firms here. They are too far up. They are also at no risk of losing their index being in the index. So for these firms, actually, the diff in diff should give you the same result. If this is all about a change in slope, this diff in diff will fail. If this is all about incentives, this diff in diff should give you the same result as the other diff in diff, right? And the paper doesn't do this, but you have one result there that almost, by the point estimate, you can infer that the effect here is about, I would say, 2/3 of the other effects. So I think you can almost bound the effect to be in between these two numbers, but you surely have a problem because the coefficient is not quite the same. It's actually smaller, indicating that this relationship is shifting upwards. Not shifting, it's pivoting, right? So it's creating some confounding factor in your regressions. Second possible solutions, short range effects, monotonicity. Show us the data. I mean, the raw data. I was looking for a graph. I was looking, this effect is quite big, 16%, 40% additional ROE. It should be visible to the naked eye. If you show me a graph of distance between these two groups, and it should have some kind of nice local properties. It should be the firms that are really around the index that care the most, the firms that are, should spread out nicely. This would be something that would be nice. Your closeness variable is a bit hardwired. You impose that 2 is bigger than, 2 is double than 1, 3 is triple than, you impose a given functional form to this thing in your regressions. I want to see just dummies, dummies of, given distances to the index. That would be much nicer. Third solution, focus on the firm problem and on densities. This is my favorite. So forget about the index, focus on the firm. Look at exposed outcomes and measure how much profitability or profits do I need to produce in order to make it to the index or to fall from the index, right? And then divide that by a meaningful measure at the firm level. For example, the standard deviation of profits at the firm level. Now you're going to have firms in the same metric that is firm-specific, that measures how far you are in terms of your own effort, in terms of your own standard deviation from making it to the index or not. Now, before JPX was introduced, the density there should be smooth. I don't know exactly what, but undistorted, because that was like a meaningless number back then. After the introduction of JPX, you should have some distortion of that density. Firms should react in terms of this. I think this is a much nicer way to see the problem, because you don't get the mess into how the index is constructed, which is a bit messy. It complicates things a little bit. Second issue, second things that I would like to mention. I think you could approach cross-sectional variation better. The effect of the paper is inherently a within-firm effect, right? And you have a lot of stability in your coefficient. Look at this. So you start throwing controls here. You start throwing time-fixed effects, industry-fixed effects, lots of controls, even lagged ROE, and the coefficient doesn't move, right? Now, this could be that the effect is very pervasive, it's very, very strong. That would be good. But it could also be that cross-sectional variation of the firms that show up in given ranges of the index is driving things. Like you mentioned in the paper, in the presentation in the paper, it's nice that firms move around a lot here, but it's nice because you can put firm fixed effects, right? If you don't put fixed effects, I don't think it's a nice property that firms move around, because there's cross-sectional differences of firms, and by reshaping, by showing here or there, maybe it's the cross-sectional variation that's driving the result, and not the within-firm variation. So you could put firm fixed effects, or you could just relate the firm's ROE to the firm's ROE 1 quarter before, for example, something really, really narrow. Third econometric issue, the Nikkei 2 to 5 firms. One of the results of the papers is that the effect is largely driven by Nikkei 2 to 5 firms. And your interpretation is, look, these firms are the firms that have most to lose, right? If I don't make it to the 400 index being a 2 to 5 firm, a big firm, these are just ranked by size, right? And liquidity, okay, then it's going to be a shame on me, right? And that could be potentially one explanation. An alternative is that it's hardwired in the formula that if you're a large firm, your incentives to perform are higher because you get more for it. If you're a small firm, if you improve your ROE, you only get something from here, but not much from here. But if you're a large firm, you get from both. You're going to climb more ranks for a given improvement in ROE. So this could be just incentives. Large firms have more incentives to outperform than small firms. Another thing that worries me is that if a large firm, say a top 100 firm shows up in the 400 rank, it's because that year they were very, very unprofitable. It's the only way, right? Remember, it's just size and profitability. So if you show up in the lower ranks, it's because you were very unprofitable, and your ROE is very mean reverting. You have a coefficient of 0.3 on the lagged ROE. So if your ROE is very low this year, your ROE will be high next year. It could be just a mechanical bouncing back of those firms into the future, right? So I think these are things that you should probably try to take into account. Let's switch more to economics. I think the paper focuses mostly on this idea of prestige and this idea that this is like a symbolic carrot. And I think at the beginning it clearly is. This is just a line in the sand, has no meaning. But I think very, very quickly it may become a bundle of many, many things. Customers may like your firm more and buy more your products. The government investment fund, pension investment fund took it as a benchmark. Even though the tracking of funds is not very big, there may be a lot of things going on very, very quickly that become a bundle of many things beyond prestige. So I think I buy the idea that this was originally just a carrot that was made of air, but suddenly it becomes tangible very, very quickly. So the interpretation is not exactly the same here. Similar point, is this all about additional performance or is this about signaling? So let me give you a very simple argument. Suppose that before the index, the beliefs of investors are the same on both sides of the index. We think that firms are the same. And firms act accordingly, they don't care. Now, the index could become a way to coordinate beliefs. Then investors think, look, after the index, the good firms are above, the bad firms are below. And firms take potentially costly actions, even value-destroying actions, to signal that they are good. The good firms, the bad firms give up. Right? And we get into a separating equilibrium. The good firms are above, the bad firms are below. Very, very standard. Is this the same story? Well, not exactly, because in the signaling story, you don't create any value. The value was there to start with. The firms were just messed around. They were messed up. They were confused. Now they are separated. But all this ROE, all these profits, they were there already. It's just that the firms have been sorted better. Right? It's important to know which part of this is genuine profitability and which part of it is that we are sorting the firms into profitable and unprofitable. Right? I think this is something that would be important. Some small comments. The moment I see an index, I start thinking of multitasking. I start thinking of incentives to neglect other dimensions. Is there anything that these firms are neglecting in order to, I mean, when I saw that R&D was going down by quite a lot, I thought, that doesn't sound too good. I mean, some of the results look nice, but some of the results look like they could be value destroying. It would be nice to have this feel of what are firms creating, but what is the index destroying as well? You know, whenever you have a very simple, very coarse measure, you would always have these incentives to distort your incentives. The paper shows that firms with more slack tend to react more. I think it's a nice result. I don't think it discriminates against many theories, right? If you're at the frontier, well, where can you go? I mean, you can't produce any more, right? It has to be the firms with more slack. It's nice that you can empirically show it, but I mean, I think it doesn't help us in terms of understanding what's going on so much. The final thing, the paper is quite happy. The writing of the paper, you seem to be quite happy about how commensurate the ROE result and the abnormal returns result is. And you didn't mention this much in the paper, but there's a 16% increase in ROE, and the abnormal returns are about 20% market cap increase. But my point is that this ROE should be very temporary, should be very short-lived, precisely because these firms only show up in this frontier for a small time. This should be a temporary effect. That doesn't sound that commensurate to me. Like, abnormal returns should be the discounted value of all these future ROEs. Maybe there are permanent effects. Once you improve your ROE, it stays there for a long while. But then, you would have problems of spillovers into the control group. And I mean, there's a lot of things there that I would like to see in terms of whether these two things really match or not. Summary, very novel question, lots of interesting results, very, very rich paper. It's already very complete. I'm sorry I'm giving you a lot of homework, but it's already a very long paper and nice. I think there's room for improvement in terms of ruling out alternative stories. But it's very rich, so I think you have a lot of nice things that you could do. And also, I would like to learn more on the economic forces. Is this prestige? Is this the bundling of many things? Is this signaling? Is this genuine value creation or just sorting? And also on the market reaction, whether it's at par with what we see in terms of ROE. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Fantastic comments. Do you mind if I'll just address a couple of things on my mind. One is on the market reaction point, what we're showing, I think the result you're referring to is a complete back of the envelope. So that's a result that assumes some level of persistence, so back of the envelope. What we do have, though, is a result that looks at, we have two results on market assessment of the ROE. One is from the index inclusion fuzzy RD design. We don't find that the market, that being in the index improves your market multiple. But in table 9, what we show is that the improvement in ROE from firms with greater incentives comes along with it an improvement in market multiples, which might suggest that firms at least are expecting some level of persistence. It's not completely a one-time only thing. The signaling story, I just want to make sure I understand. In this signaling story, would you expect the multiples to increase or no? It sounds to me like multiples would increase if you're in the index.
No, not necessarily. I mean, it would require that firms that don't make it to the index but improve their ROE are better firms. But the firms that try to make it to the index are better firms.
I see. Okay, so we'll have to think a little harder about how to distinguish that. The prestige versus bundling story, we fully acknowledge the many complicated things that could be going on here. So for one, and we've tried to do a little bit of homework, and I would appreciate whatever suggestions you guys have about how we can better show this. One is we try to figure out whether or not there could be any evidence that, look, to the extent that this is a well-known index, perhaps it's providing some sort of free marketing for people, and it helps you sell products if you're a customer-facing company. Our sense from talking to some of the folks in Japan is that while this index is well known in the corporate governance world, it's not so clear that consumers are well aware of this. In any event, when we looked at things like sales growth as an outcome, which might be one thing that could experience an increase from inclusion, we also don't capture it there. You made some really nice comments about the kind of mechanical nature about how the incentives could vary for the score depending on the size and the level of ROE. We hadn't thought about it in such a clear fashion as you present, but for similar reasons, we try to make our comparisons conditional on the same level of ROE. That's why we always condition on the last period's ROE. As well as for size. Now, it may be that those are very imperfect controls, but that's at least some attempt at addressing these underlying issues that you have in mind. And because we have lag-dependent variable, this is precisely the reason why we don't have the firm-fixed effect in there. So, but we've certainly run versions that just looks at the firm-fixed effect. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Charles, this is a fascinating paper. I want to suggest sort of an off the top of my head alternative behavioral explanation.
Yes.
And the reason for that is the notion of, so here's a background. We've got Japan, we've a stakeholder regime built around main banks, lifetime employment. We hit a very lengthy, no traditional incentives built into that system, an ecosystem and then we hit somebody comes up with a clever idea that creates an incentive and everything changes. So an alternative hypothesis, which may be correct, consistent with your data, is that what was given, maybe it's a political economy story, what was given wasn't an incentive but a license. That is, what it did was allow the 250 500 most successful companies to be able to collectively change that stakeholder system and give them cover for it. Now, what that suggests is that there was a reason why it took so many years for all of this to happen, because individual companies couldn't move on their own. They were missing a coordination. Missing a coordination mechanism. This was a coordination mechanism. It obviously had some, there were conversations with the government in going forward with it. And what it suddenly said is the game's different.
Yes.
Now, the way I would then, and let's just assume that it's the license, not incentive hypothesis. The difference in difference results means that I can now make changes. And surprise, the better companies are more effective at making changes than the companies who are 800 or number 800 instead of 250. Which would and there the story is that incentives aren't everything. It requires skill. If somebody offers me $500,000 to make a penalty kick against the Real Madrid goalie, I can't do it. And they can double it, and I still can't do it. Here, what you end up with, if you have, in effect, a governmentally sanctioned license to change the relationship amongst the historical relationship among stakeholders, then your prediction about who would do best in that now making those kinds of changes, your prediction, I take it, would be the companies who were most skilled
yes.
would take would have the most effect.
Yes.
And so the people furthest away would do less well
yes.
than everybody else. And all I'm suggesting is this is a different way of connecting the dots, which maybe is maybe closer to what the Japanese corporate governance and the J form and the like was before that.
Yeah.
And maybe the way you could distinguish between the two is beginning to look at actual operating changes. What happened to employment levels?
Yeah.
What happened to the supplier relationship?
Yeah.
Which might let you distinguish
Yeah.
between two perfectly
Yeah.
plausible stories.
So thank you. I really like the way you summarize that. So I think that our, at least, theory that we've been thinking about for what's happening is not different from what you're calling the license story. That this is, we think about this as a coordinating mechanism as well. But what intrigues us is why, I mean, this is kind of an odd-looking mechanism for changing corporate norms. To my understanding, corporate governance, I mean, Japan seems to have been on the way to try to change corporate governance to be more shareholder-friendly for a long time. I mean, on paper, they've got very strong shareholder rights. But yeah, and we think that this is a coordinating mechanism in the sense that it tries to get the elites in the business world to engage in the desired behavior. Now, what I don't think our evidence is consistent with your story is the idea that, well, maybe it's just the best guys do it, because, and this might be subject to some of Vigente's comments, that when we looked at the guys who do it the best, the ones who ranked 1 to 300, their performance improvements are no different than the guys who are ranked low. So it really is the guys right at the middle. Now we have to kind of consider those slope issues, but it's the guys right at the middle, which would suggest to me that this is really about not unleashing the guys who can do it, but it's also about incentives. I mean, what you say could be part of the story as well.
Just a quick thought. For the people who are close to the threshold and
Yes.
are facing a risk of losing their index inclusion, is it possible that they have incentives not just to increase their ROE, but to engage in acquisitions that would increase their market capitalization? Because that's a pretty easy way of increasing its market capitalization. So you could try to test whether there is any increase in acquisition activity. And if there is, then it might have somewhat different normative consequences.
Absolutely. We haven't looked at that. We're like trying to contain the size of this paper, but certainly in theory, I agree that could be. You know, we did try to, by the way, look at a variety of what you might call unintended consequences. This actually is one we haven't looked at. The R&D result, just to go back to the discussant's comment we did, was one of the things that was suggested to us, although we don't know what to say normatively, because when we talk to some of the Japanese corporate governance experts, they sometimes tell us, actually, that's not a bad thing, because there could be overinvestment in R&D, and we're cutting back. I mean, we observe about a 7% decline in R&D intensity. I don't know if that's really big, but we have no way of telling whether or not that's efficient or inefficient. We did look at employment levels. We don't see cuts in employment levels. We don't see people cutting unprofitable divisions, but yeah, I mean, acquisitions is something that we can certainly look at easily.
Okay, well, thank you so much for a great presentation. And for me, as a Japanese corporate governance scholar, it was very interesting. And I did not think that JPX 400 is this effective. And so I have actually 2 comments or questions. One is about the difference between the top 300 companies and the 300 to 500. One possibility could be that top 300 companies were already doing their best on ROE in Japanese sense, not in global standard. But so maybe it could be the case that there was not much room for them to improve even after JPX 400 was introduced. And for the bottom half, they might have had more room. So maybe one thing you could do is to check the amount of the slack that you've mentioned for the top 300 and the others.
Yeah, so again, this goes back to, this is one of the reasons why we thought controlling for things like lagged ROE is so important, because the ROE improvement conditional on current period ROE is very different if your starting point last period is 2% versus 12%. But we can certainly cut our results to try to figure out what's the neighborhood of lagged ROE where we see the most improvement over the next period.
Okay, yeah, and one more point, and it's about the external volatility of your study. So you've mentioned that this could be generalized.
I wasn't expecting this from a Japanese scholar.
No. Yeah, so I thought that, well, one question I had when I read your paper is that why do Japanese managers care about this inclusion to JPX 400? Because this is not their personal prestige. It's directly the prestige of the company.
Great, yeah.
And well, and I can imagine actually that Japanese managers care about the company's prestige, because as you have mentioned, they always worked for the good of the company as kind of a community. And it could be the case that their employees also care about their companies being included in, and also maybe Japanese managers would love to be included in the index created by the government, to be called by the best companies of Japan.
Yes.
And I'm not sure whether other Asian countries, or more precisely Asian controllers of large companies, care about such things. It's their company, but they own it and they get money from it. So I just wondered whether they would care about those non-monetary prestige. But I don't have any answer, and it's not a question that Japanese can answer. So
We have other Asian scholars in the room.
Just to add, I was thinking the same thing actually when I was listening to this too, whether the Japanese managers or really people in Japan really care whether you are included in a Nikkei 400 or not. And it's a new index that somebody, Nikkei and Topics, in Tokyo Stock Exchange, invented it in 2014, right? And then the government maybe participated a little bit, and who cares about this index per se? And the second point about technical part of it, because I'm working on this a little bit as well, and the inclusion and the exclusion is only 5% from 2014. So basically, I think the result maybe you find so stable, because most of the firms stay. So very few, like 5% of the firm are excluded or included, I think, in that.
Sorry, included or excluded
400, Nikkei 400. Yeah, constituents, the firms. Really few firms, really few changes.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I just looked at the data a moment ago, opened it up too.
Oh, so Matt, you might know, where's Matt? You might know this a bit better, but we find the churn at least around, but I guess around the threshold of inclusion, there's quite a bit of churn.
But then the
overall,
the list, very few changes.
Yes. Overall, you're absolutely right.
Because you're trying to replicate the index, the way the calculation, right? Another thing that I think you didn't mention besides the ROE and market cap, also they said good corporate governance firms. And I don't know how they define that, because they've never been clear about how the index define good corporate governance firms. So it's difficult to replicate what you're trying to do.
My understanding is that goes into part of the qualitative adjustment assessment. And our understanding from talking to the JPX is that that's a very small component of what drives inclusion. It could be up to 10 firms, but no more.
Yeah, so I might have missed this, but you emphasize there's no pecuniary incentive to be included. But have you done an event study or something? I mean, we know from the S&P 500 that when you get excluded or excluded, there's an abnormal return, so lower cost of capital.
Yeah.
Is that not true here?
Yeah, so in our fuzzy regression discontinuity design, we try to estimate what's the effect if you're the first firm that gets in and compare it to the first firm that basically got dropped out. We find no liquidity differences, no book-to-market differences, no differences in executive compensation.
Yeah, what about abnormal returns? What about stock price?
Oh, that we haven't looked at. Sorry about that. Yeah, so that's something we can easily do. Yeah.